My husband cheated and left me when I was mourning my parents' passing. Now he is running back to me after finding out I'm inheriting $7 million. I, 27F, am in the middle of a fight with my soon-to-be ex-husband, Jeff, who had an extramarital affair a couple of months ago. Jeff and I had been married for 2 years and we've been together for almost 3 years before that. He and I had planned on beginning to try for a baby just 8 months into our marriage because we'd already been living together for 4 years at that point and we really wanted to start a family together, so it just felt right. Unfortunately, even after months and months of trying, I was still struggling with conceiving, so we had to get tested. Turns out that both my husband and I have fertility issues, so we had to give up on the idea for the time being. It hit me hard when the test results came back, and I kind of shut down emotionally because I really wanted a baby of my own. Jeff, instead of being supportive during that time, distanced himself from me, and we barely even spoke for a couple of months. I was already at my lowest by then, and Jeff going further away from me just made it worse. So, I thought about reaching out to him and making our marriage work, but before I could do that, he confessed to me that he'd been having an affair with an old friend, and it had been going on for weeks. He'd sought out her help a couple of days after we got back the test results since he used to be good friends back in high school, and she was in town for a conference. They had lunch together, and then that turned into an opportunity for him to cheat on me with her. He told me that he wanted to tell me the truth, but I just seemed so distant and sad that he was afraid of how I'd react, so he just didn't say anything, which was a pretty ridiculous reason. I remember wanting to say a lot of things after he told me, mostly wanting to scream at him, but I couldn't bring myself to do any of it. So, I just broke down on the couch and began to sob like a baby. He didn't even console me or anything, not even a pat on my arm to tell me it's going to be all right. He just sat there like a damn statue and said nothing while I cried for almost an hour. After I finally eased up a little, he told me that he was going to spend the night at his parents' place because he needed a break from everything that was going on. I begged him to stay in spite of what he'd done, but he didn't wait around. He'd already had his bags packed before discussing this with me, and then he just left. As soon as he left, I started crying again and remained in the same spot until midnight. It was pretty much the worst day of my life so far. I was so depressed that I wasn't responding to any calls or texts from anyone, not work and not even people I knew personally. So, a couple of friends and relatives had come to check up on me, but they'd leave when they realized that I wasn't going to open the door for them and let them in. I'd let them know I was still there by yelling out that they needed to leave and that I wasn't going to open the door, so they'd know I was okay and then leave. I'm grateful for the people who checked up on me honestly, because I don't think I'd be here right now if it wasn't for them. All I did was have the minimum amount of food needed to keep going, watch TV, and then sleep. I was basically a zombie for almost 2 weeks. Then one day, one of my cousins came by, and I told him to leave my living room, but he didn't go. Instead, he told me that he had important news to share and he needed to do it in person. I didn't take it seriously and argued with him, so he finally snapped and told me that he was here to inform me that my father had passed away that morning from a heart attack, and since I never checked my phone, people didn't have any way of letting me know about it. I was already pretty heartbroken from whatever had happened with Jeff, and then the news of my dad's demise just broke me even more. After my cousin, who visited me to tell me the news, left, I think I started crying so loudly that the neighbors had to come to my door to make sure I was okay. That evening, I booked myself a flight back home for the funeral, and it was really difficult because I barely knew what I was doing all throughout. I had to be helped by people I barely even knew because I was so lost, but somehow, I got back home safely and made it through the funeral. I was blank and didn't cry at the funeral much, but I'd planned on staying for 2 weeks at home with my mother so she'd have someone to count on. She was devastated at the funeral and didn't leave my side even for a second, but we barely got to speak because of the sheer number of guests and relatives showing up. My dad was a well-known man, he was an attorney and was one of the best in his town. He was also a really good man, and people loved him. Some people had even traveled overseas to pay their last respects, so you guys can imagine what sort of love and respect people had for him. My mother and I were overwhelmed, and for the 2 days after the funeral, we just made small talk. I'm grateful for even that much because just 3 days after the funeral, I lost my mother as well. The medical report said that my mother had passed away due to natural causes, and since she'd passed in her sleep, it had been peaceful for her. But I knew that she passed away from a broken heart. Call me crazy, but that's what I really believed. Within days of my father's funeral, we had to organize another funeral for my mother, and this was smaller but hit me even harder than my dad's death because this had happened while I was fast asleep in the next room. I think I pretty much shut my brain off after my mom's passing and was a robot. I flew back home after the funeral and finished off some legal paperwork with the executor of their will, my dad's secretary. There was nothing for me to stay back for anymore, so I came back to my own home and resumed my old routine of eating, watching television, and then going to sleep. My life spiraled out of control after that day because I was so depressed that I could barely bring myself to eat or sleep. I lost my job after 1 week because I hadn't shown up at work for a while and neither had I told anyone anything about my absence, so they had reason to fire me without notice. Besides, it's been ages since I responded to anyone from work, so I should have seen it coming, but it was still a huge blow. This time, hardly anyone came by to check on me because everyone thought that I was staying back at my childhood home, and it was a relief because I didn't want to see anyone and vice versa. So, that was the last 4 months of my life after my parents' passing. I haven't had a job for almost 5 or 6 months and haven't done anything outside of the house for just as long, if not longer. I don't talk to anyone, and it was only recently that I realized that I've been a total mess. I've neglected everything apart from paying the rent and bills on time and doing the absolute bare minimum. I was in this state for almost 1.5 months until one day I decided that I wanted to comb my hair because my head was really heavy, and I wanted to do something about it because it was uncomfortable. I finally looked at myself in the mirror that day and realized that my hair was a rat's nest, my clothes were grimy and dirty, and my face was all sunk in and hollow, like I was straight out of some horror movie. I was disgusted by my appearance, but I still tried to brush my hair, and the plastic hairbrush snapped into two because of how tangled my hair had become. It was a small, insignificant thing, but that was a wake-up call for me.